Test, test. Yeah, that's not supposed to happen. None of the mics are, like, speech is not turned on in the main, but somehow. Uncheck main, or program. Turn the mic back off. Test, test, test. Okay, it's coming through program. It's something in the switcher, right? Because program comes back. No. Test, test. Turn it back on to program. I want to troubleshoot this real quick. Turn program on. Also, put this back on the placeholder. Wrong one. Now put that one back. All right, test. Still doing it. All right, mute it back, Kyle. Oh, I can do it. No worries.
We get started like 5 after.
Yeah.
Give me 1 more second. Is that all right?
That's fine. When you put this on, just make sure it's like actually pointed up. Because if it's like that, it doesn't work as well. That's all. Test, test, test. Test, 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 test. Test, test. Test, test. Oh. That's because program is coming out from in there when it shouldn't be. Oh, I don't know why the chairs are so low. Good point. Test.
This is muted, right?
It is now. Talk about 48-hour launch, so when you... All right. Okay.
Maybe.
Sorry, guys. Sorry. Holding the line up. All right. Here we are. Welcome to SHADEV edition 235. 235. Want to thank our sponsors here, all these wonderful folk. They give us money so that we can give you food. Give them a round of applause. Yeah, go ahead. Don't be shy. This is it's a wonderful thing. Bring some of you people out that, wouldn't come otherwise. So I know. I do the same thing, so it's fine. All right. So I think Tim wants to come up and talk to us a little bit about 48-hour launch. Everybody give a round of applause to Tim. That's right. No, it's fine. Yeah.
Hey, yeah, like you said, my name's Tim. I work downstairs on the first floor at CoLab doing communications there. How many of you guys have either been to or heard of or anything about 48-hour launch? Okay, a few of you guys. So we haven't had it in a couple of years. What 48-hour launch is it's kind of like taking a business accelerator and putting an accelerator into a weekend. So coming up soon, we're going to have this event on September 9th through 11th. What that's going to look like is that people are going to apply their ideas for 48-hour launch. I'll tell you a little bit more about what the theme is for this year. But what you do is you show up for this sort of pre-pitch event on Friday night, come with a couple of team members already in mind. That Friday night, you're going to pitch your idea. You're going to have a few more people who are probably enthusiastic to join you. And the goal is by the end of that weekend is to kind of develop either a prototype or a kind of like improved and thought out business model, and then you pitch it on Sunday night at the end of the weekend. The prizes for it, Mozilla is co-sponsoring it with us, so we're sending 2 people to MozFest in London this fall from the winners. We'll give cash prizes, we'll give business services like legal advising, accounting advising, anything you need, and of course, more that we're probably still figuring out. So this year's, we're kind of bringing to you with Mozilla the Internet of Things edition. You guys being tech people, you know what that means, so I feel like I shouldn't have to explain it. If you have any more technical questions about that, ask Andrew. Probably he could give you a good explanation, or feel free to come visit us downstairs. So yeah, if you have any ideas in that realm, especially any of those ideas in that realm that could prove beneficial in a classroom, I encourage you to go onto our website and apply. It's just colab.co/48-hour launch. Go check it out. Applications are due on August 26th. I think that's 2 weeks from tomorrow. So put your heads together with some people and think of some ideas, and we hope to see you.
Thank you, Tim. Any other announcements before we get right into this thing? Anybody else? Any meetups? Scenic City Summit is tomorrow. How many of you don't know what Scenic City Summit is? You don't know. Okay, so it's Chattanooga's very own tech conference. So they're bringing in some great speakers, and it's tomorrow. Let's see, anybody here who's helping run Scenic City? Where are you at? Yeah? You're speaking. Is it too late to register? Is it too late to get a ticket? Is it sold out? Can anybody answer that here? Boy, they're too busy working to get this thing going tomorrow, so that's why they're not here. You probably can still go. There's probably still some tickets, and I think that they maybe even said that they ordered some extra t-shirts, so you still might be able to get a t-shirt, which is really the most important part of a tech conference, especially this one, because I can tell you that the t-shirt is quite soft. I have felt it.
And it is one that you will want to wear and not necessarily use to cut up and polish your silver. So without further ado, we've got Jessica Ivins here, facilitator, is that the proper term? At Center. And I know she has some exciting news to share with all of us today, but beside her wonderful presentation that she's about to give. So you guys give it up for Jessica.
Brett, and thank you to the CHADEV Lunch folks for having me today. So I do have some exciting news. I'm a faculty member at Center, the UX Design School here in downtown Chattanooga, and we are opening. We're going to have our first class of students, and our classes start on October 17th, and we are still looking for students. So if you or someone you know is interested, please feel free to talk with me or check us out online at centercenter.com. And I'll be talking a little bit more about Center today. So the presentation today is Become a Better Self-Driven Learner. I'd like to start by telling you a story of sharpening the saw. This is a story that I read in Stephen Covey's book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. One day, a woodcutter strained to saw down a tree. A young man walked by and saw the woodcutter straining to saw down this tree, and the young man said, "What are you doing?" And the woodcutter replied, "I'm cutting down this tree." The young man said, "You look exhausted. Why don't you take a break to sharpen your saw?" The woodcutter explained to the young man that he had been sawing all day and did not have time to take a break. The young man pushed back and said, "But if you took a break to sharpen your saw, you'd saw much faster." And the woodcutter replied, "I don't have time to take a break. Don't you see how busy I am?" I really like this story because it's a metaphor for taking time to make yourself better physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. In this story I just told you, the woodcutter didn't realize that if he just took a break to sharpen his saw and then went back to sawing down the tree, he'd be much more effective and he'd be much more efficient. Oftentimes we find ourselves caught in this very dilemma. And again, this is a metaphor, so this applies to many areas of our life. Learning is actually one of the ways that we sharpen the saw. Learning is something that we do to keep our skills fresh and to keep our skills relevant. And it's part of life, right? We don't just learn professionally, we learn in our personal lives as well. If you're like me, you probably have a list of things that you want to learn. This is my abbreviated list of things that I want to learn. It's actually a lot longer. Here are some things that I want to learn, like advanced graphic design methods, Sketch, Affinity Designer, Git and GitHub, UX scenarios, field research, journey mapping. The list actually goes on and on. I'll spare you. I won't read you the entire list, but I have it documented somewhere. Chances are you have a list too. Maybe you also have it documented, or maybe it's just in your head. The truth is, we often focus on what we need to learn, and very rarely do we focus on how we can learn more effectively. I'll give you an example of this. UX designers often feel the need to learn more prototyping tools. There are lots and lots of prototyping tools out there available to UX designers. There seem to be more coming out all the time. Here are 5 of the ones that I've found: Axure, Sketch, Envision, UXPin, Pix8. Axure and Sketch and Envision and UXPin happen to be really popular, and Pix8 is on there too. There are actually dozens of prototyping tools available right now to UX designers. And it gets overwhelming, and UX designers feel this pressure, like in order to stay relevant, they have to learn all these tools, and they have to be proficient at all these tools. This is Chris Risden. He's an expert in UX design, and he also teaches workshops on prototyping. People often ask Chris, what prototyping tool should I learn? Right? He gets that question a lot. And he has a great response to this question. When people ask Chris, what prototyping tools should I learn? He says it's important to learn how to learn new tools quickly instead of focusing on what tools to learn. Chances are you might use 1 or 2 prototyping tools now if you're a UX designer, and they might work for you now, but that's probably not going to last for very long. Pretty soon you're going to have to learn another one. A better one's going to come out that is able to help you more effectively than the tool you're using now. Or maybe a new project's going to come on your desk, and the tools that you use now just aren't appropriate for that project. Maybe you'll get another job, and you'll join a new team that's using a completely different suite of tools than what you're using now. So this is why Chris emphasizes the importance of learning how to learn more effectively when it comes to prototyping tools, rather than paying attention to what tools you should learn. And this doesn't just apply to prototyping. It applies to a lot of the things that we do in our field because our field changes so rapidly and so often. I've come to see learning in our field as like a game of whack-a-mole. Like we learn one thing, we get decent at it, and then other things pop up, and we just keep having to learn, right? And every time we think we've learned everything we need to learn, like 3 more things pop up, and then 2 more things pop up. So in this whack-a-mole game of learning, the learning never ends. Some of the best industry professionals I know are self-driven learners. They're really good at playing this whack-a-mole game of learning. I want to tell you about my former colleague. I'll call him Brian. He's a well-rounded front-end generalist. He can convert static CSS to Sass. He can run a usability test. He can design a beautiful layout, page layout. He's also a great photographer. So he's very, very well-rounded. He's pretty good at a lot of things. When I worked with Brian a few years ago at my previous job, I mentored him in UX design because he was very good at front-end development and graphic design. He didn't know a lot about UX, and he wanted to learn from me. So I taught him how to do a usability test. And traditionally, when you do a usability test, you read from a script, so you have a participant who's participating in the test, and you read from a script when you're moderating the test. So I gave Brian the script, and he looked at me and he said, I don't think this is going to work for me. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, I suck at reading out loud. I'm not good at reading. And I was really surprised, because I thought, wow, this guy's really good at a lot of stuff, and now he's telling me he's not good at reading. And before I could say anything, he said, all right, I think I know how I can get around this. I'm going to go off and I'm going to read the script on my own, and I'm going to create a checklist. And when I'm moderating the test, I'll just look at that checklist, and that checklist, will help me remember to say everything that I need to say to the participant. And I said, okay, so let's try that. I've never done a test that way, but let's try that. And that's what he did, and that's how he learned to do usability testing. And he made it work for him. The more that I worked with Brian, the more I realized that how self-aware he was of what he was good at and what he struggled with, and how good he was at adapting to his own limitations. Brian is great at finding quick, effective ways to learn. And even though I was the one mentoring him and I had more experience than him, he inspired me to become a better learner, and he inspired me to figure out how I could become more efficient at my own learning. The way you learn best is unique to you, just like Brian's way of learning is unique to him. I love to read. I read tons of books every year. I'm like a total bookworm, and I love learning from books. But that doesn't necessarily work for Brian. And what works for Brian and what works for me might be completely different from what works for you. Like any skill, learning is a skill that you can improve with practice. The more you improve your learning, the better you'll get and the faster you'll get. And as a result, you get to spend less time learning and more time actually doing the things that you need to do. Today I'm going to share 5 tips for becoming a better learner. By the way, I am going to make my slides available afterwards. I forgot to say that earlier, so no need to, if you're a note taker, you don't need to take frantic notes. And those things are identify your learning obstacles, use a learning resource in a different way, fit learning into your routine, reflect on what you learn, and reflect on how you learn. Number 1 is identify your learning obstacles. If you're struggling to learn something, chances are there's an obstacle in your way. And if you can figure out what that obstacle is, there's a good chance that you can work around it and make your learning better. I'm going to tell you a story about my learning experience at the noisy car dealership. Last year, I took my Honda into the Honda repair place, to the dealer to get a repair, and I knew I was going to be at the dealership for a few hours. Now, this was a business, this was a weekday, and I wanted to make sure I could get work done, so I brought my laptop with me. So they take my car back, I go to the waiting room, and I'm ready to get work done, and I realize that the waiting room is actually really loud. I wasn't prepared for this. The TV was on, it was blaring. There was a little kids section, so people actually brought their kids in, and the kids were playing with toys and shrieking and doing their kid stuff. So I realized, okay, this is not really going to work for me because I had to do a lot of reading and a lot of writing, and I just couldn't concentrate because of all the noise. And there was nothing I could really do about the noise. I wasn't going to sit there and tell everybody to be quiet because that's not very nice. So I'm trying to figure out how I can get around this, and then an idea popped into my head. And I thought, all right, well, I have my phone with me, I have my headphones with me, why don't I try a white noise app? I had never listened to a white noise app before ever in my life. So I downloaded this one, it's called White Noise. I found it in the App Store. I installed it, I turned it on, and I put on my headphones, and it worked like a charm. So I was able to drown out all of the surrounding noise just enough to be able to focus and get reading and writing done for work. The learning obstacle for me that day was disruptive noise. I couldn't get rid of the noise, but I was able to identify it. And even though I couldn't get rid of the obstacle at the source, I was able to find a way to work around it. Another obstacle that we often face is time. A lot of people will say, I wish I had more time to read a book. I wish I had more time to listen to a podcast. I wish I had more time to do X, Y, and Z. If you can't find more time, maybe that's the case. Chances are maybe you could find more time. But if you can't, think about maybe how you can make the resource work faster for you. I'll share an example. Let's imagine that you want to listen to more podcasts. And for podcasts, you can try a player that speeds up audio while preserving audio quality. This is a screenshot of Overcast. This is the app that I use on my iPhone. I think you have to pay like $5 for it, but it's pretty awesome because with Overcast, it has really smart speed settings so that you can increase the speed of a podcast up to 2 times or maybe even a little higher. So what I do is I increase it to 1.5. You can see over here I've increased it right in the middle. And it lets me get through a 30-minute podcast in 20 minutes. Now all of a sudden I've taken a 30-minute task and I've condensed it down. So it's a lot less intimidating in terms of making time. You can also do the same thing with video. So before I worked at Center, I almost never watched video to learn, which was a bummer because there's tons of good stuff out there. There's all sorts of free conference presentations that are available on YouTube or Vimeo. Video tutorials, some of them are free, some of them you have to pay for, but there's a lot of good stuff in that format that's available out there. But I never had the patience to sit down for 45 minutes or an hour in front of my laptop and do nothing else but watch a video. I just couldn't make myself do it. And then when I joined the team at Center, they told me that you can use a video player that speeds up video and audio while preserving quality. So same thing with the other player I just told you about. The podcast player, when it speeds things up, it does preserve audio quality. So the person you're listening to, they don't sound like Alvin and the Chipmunks. They sound like a normal person that's just talking really fast. So that's the beauty of a good video or audio player that has these features. I learned about a piece of software called MySpeed. So you can purchase it. I think it's about $30 for a license. And what it does is it increases the speed of video in your browser. So every week now, we use MySpeed for our weekly lunch and learn. We have a brown bag lunch and learn at work. And we can get through a 90-minute video in about 50 minutes. And you do get used to the speed after a while. At first, it sounds a little funny because the people are talking quickly, but then you get used to it. And you get used to it to the point where it's actually really slow to listen to people in real time. So if we have to attend a webinar or something, like a live webinar, we're like, so slow, speed it up, yeah. And unfortunately, we can't speed up real life yet. We haven't figured that out. But we can speed up a recorded video. So if time is a learning obstacle, ask yourself if there's a way to make a resource work faster for you. I just gave you 2 examples that we've found at Center that work for us. But chances are, if there's another learning resource you're trying to use, and there's an obstacle to it, if you can identify it, you can get around it. Number 2 is use a learning resource in a different way. Sometimes the resource itself is the obstacle. And if that's the case, think about how you can use the resource in a way that works for you. For example, let's say that you're a slow reader, right? I hear this from a lot of good people in our field. They'll tell me, lots of smart people I know will say, I want to read more books, but I'm a painfully slow reader. So think about maybe how you can make the resource work for you in an unconventional way. One of the things that I've learned at Center is that if it's a nonfiction book, if it's a book that you're using for work, you don't have to read it from cover to cover. It just took me a long time to come to that realization. You can actually treat it like a tool. You can go through and read the chapters that you need to read the sections that you need to read. I know somebody who recently just finished grad school, and he told me that all the books that he had to read for grad school, he had this method where he would read the introduction, he would read the conclusion, and then he would go back and skim the chapters, and he'd start tackling the book that way. And it saved him hours at a time when he was going through books. It was a pretty cool technique that he found. So remember that the tools that you use at your disposal for learning for work purposes, they're tools. They're not necessarily things that you have to use in a conventional way. So if you're reading a Harry Potter novel, you probably have to read it from start to finish, or else you're going to be confused about what's happening. That's the way that fiction is. But with nonfiction, it's a completely different story. And the goal of reading a nonfiction book is really to learn. It's not necessarily to read the book from cover to cover. You can also use podcasts in a different way. So I talked about using a book in a different way. You can also use a transcript from a podcast. Not all podcasts have transcripts, but some of them do. This is Shop Talk Show. It's a really good front-end development podcast. So if you're interested in getting into some podcasts for front-end development, I recommend this one. It's a lot of fun and it's informative. They have a transcript. They always have a transcript, which is great. Again, not all of them do. But if a podcast provides a transcript, you can read it like an article. You can do like a little, Control F to look for keywords to see if, it actually has the information in it that you're looking for. Sometimes I do that, and then I say, okay, there's a lot of good stuff in here, so I'll actually listen to the podcast. Or sometimes I'll do a search and I'll be like, I don't see a lot of good stuff in here. It's not what I'm looking for. I'm not going to waste my time trying to listen to this podcast. This is another way that you can use a podcast differently, is by taking advantage of the transcripts. So remember, try using learning resources in a different way. There are lots of other resources that you probably have at your disposal that you might be able to change the way you use them in a way that works more effectively for you. Number 3 is fit learning into your routine. You may have more opportunities throughout your day to learn than you think you do. A few years ago, I took on a new job, and I had an hour-long driving commute. And I hadn't had a long commute like that in a really long time. So I went from basically having a short city commute. When I lived in the city of Philadelphia, I had a 15-minute bus ride, and then when I got a new job in the suburbs, I had to drive an hour each way. So I liked the job, but I really wasn't thrilled about the fact that I was stuck in a car for 2 hours. And I thought, okay, what am I going to do with my time for 2 hours? How am I going to make this productive? And that's when I started getting into podcasts, listening to podcasts for the first time. And that got me hooked. So every morning I had an hour to listen to a podcast, and that's what I did with myself every morning. And I went from dreading my hour-long commute to looking forward to what I would learn every morning on my way to work. That worked out pretty well for me in terms of fitting in all the podcasts into my schedule. This was a few years ago before I moved to Chattanooga. But when I moved here, I ended up getting a job downtown and living downtown. So I went back to a short, 15-minute walking commute. And I just didn't have that hour every weekday in the morning to listen to podcasts anymore. The challenge was I was so hooked on podcasts, I wanted to fit them into my schedule, but now I had to make a change, right? Because I didn't have that driving commute anymore. And that's when I realized that for me, there are a lot of activities anyway, and probably for you, where you can also listen to podcasts. So things like cleaning, exercising, cooking, showering. I highly recommend a Bluetooth water-resistant shower speaker. It's pretty nerdy, but it's pretty awesome, and you can listen to music or stuff in the shower. Getting ready for work in the morning, I listen to podcasts then, and then driving a familiar route. So if I'm not having to, and by the way, these are all like regular activities that I kind of do on autopilot. If I'm driving to a new area that I've never been to, listening to a podcast, I won't have the cognitive resources to do that. But if I'm driving, the same route I always drive, I certainly have the cognitive resources to listen to a podcast. And I do want to say that these are activities that work for me, and that might work for you. You might have a completely different situation than I do. I don't have children, for example, so if you have kids, you're probably busy getting them ready in the morning. Or if you have other commitments outside of work that I don't have, these things might not work for you. But hopefully today, as I give you examples, my goal is for you to think about things that work for you and maybe borrow my ideas. But you don't necessarily have to think that what works for me is going to work for you. Another thing you can do is determine what time of day is best for certain types of learning. So when you're experimenting with fitting learning into your routine, pay close attention to how you learn at different times of the day. Because we do have our energy is different based on what time of the day it is. I recommend starting with mornings. I've found for me that writing and listening to podcasts is really good for me in the mornings. That's just when my brain is sharp, and that's just when I'm able to do it. And when I say morning, by the way, I mean any time before lunch. It could be before work, it could be during work, even at as late as 11 o'clock. So start experimenting with what works well for you in the morning. My boss, Jared Spool, does a lot of writing in the morning. So he's found just over the years that he's able to focus more on writing and produce better business-related writing in the morning. So you'll see, if you look at his calendar, he actually blocks off a lot of writing time in the mornings. And then he leaves time in the afternoon open for meetings and other activities. So see what works for you in the morning. Kind of start experimenting and paying attention. So experiment with where you can fit learning into your routine and pay attention to what times of day are best for you. And again, like I said, feel free to use my examples, but what works for me might not necessarily work for you, so please experiment. Number 4 is reflect on what you learn. By reflecting on what you learn, you look back on what you learn, and you see. Let me reword this. By reflecting on what you learn, you look back on what you learn so that you can remember it and so that you can make it stick. One of the best ways to reflect on what you learn is to share it with other people, believe it or not. We do this a lot at Center, the UX design school where I work. We have a learning culture, which is a good thing because we're a school, and we definitely geek out about learning. Every day we have a daily stand-up meeting, which most organizations have now. And we do a lot of the typical stand-up stuff in our daily stand-up meeting, like, we'll say, this is what I've accomplished since the last stand-up, and this is what I plan to accomplish before the next stand-up. And we address a few other questions. But the most interesting part of our daily stand-up is question number 5, that each of us answers. And that question is, what is the most important thing I learned since the last time we met, and how will what I learned change the way I approach things in the future? This is my favorite part of stand-up. It's certainly the most interesting part. And we do this every day, and every day each of us shares the most important thing we learned. And we learn so much from each other. It's like, wow, my coworker Summer just figured out how to do this. I'm glad she figured that out. I'm gonna remember that. So next time I need to do that thing, I'll know how to tackle it. So it's great for learning from each other. It's also great for helping you learn what it is that you learned. So the story I told you earlier about the white noise app, I reflected on that one day. That was actually my number 5. I was so excited that I figured that out that I shared that during my number 5. And because I shared it that day, like 6 months later, I remembered that that was an option for me when I was in a similar situation where I was trying to concentrate and there was too much noise. And just knowing myself, if I hadn't reflected on it that day and shared it with my team and had that conversation, I probably would have forgotten it, and I would have forgotten about the solution that I had discovered 6 months prior. If you don't have a strong learning culture at work, you can make one or you can find one. I would argue that there are a lot more learning cultures around than you might think, and I would say that we have one right here in this room. So hopefully we're not all here just for the free food. Maybe we are, but I'm hoping that we're actually here for a little bit more, that we're here for the learning and for the community. There are multiple ways to share what you learn in order to reflect. You can discuss it with somebody else, like I just explained. Oh, sorry about that. You can write a short blog post. You can write an online review. You can write a journal entry. The benefit of writing it down is that you have a record of it. That's one of the things that I really like. So if you don't have somebody to share it with, you can write it down. And just the act of writing it down will help you remember. And you also have a record that you can go back to later if you need to retrieve what it is that you learned. So in all, you're more likely to remember what you learn later if you reflect on it shortly after you learn it. And you can reflect either by discussing it, by writing about it, or better yet, do both. So every day after our stand-up meetings, we all post, so before our stand-up meeting, we write up everything that we're gonna share, and then we post it on Basecamp. So lucky for me, I have a record of all of my number 5s ever since I've worked at Center, and there have been many times where I'll search through Basecamp to try to jog my memory of what it is that I learned when I'm trying to remember something. So the 5th and final tip is reflect on how you learn. And what I mean by reflecting on how you learn is reflecting on the learning itself and assessing how you learn. And you can do that simply by paying attention to how you learn. You can ask yourselves questions like, is how I'm learning effective? Is it efficient? Do I enjoy it? Is this type of learning appropriate for what it is that I'm trying to do or what I'm trying to learn right now? Can I improve the way I'm learning next time I need to learn something similar? And I'll give you an example of how I reflected on my learning. I decided last year I was going to do something new with podcasts, that I was going to listen to a podcast at 3 times the speed, which is really fast, but it actually isn't that fast if you're reading the transcript while you're listening to it. So I decided I would listen to a podcast at 3 times the speed and read through the transcript and highlight the interesting parts of the transcript, which is what I did right here and down here. And I found that I could get through a 30-minute podcast in about 10 minutes. And when I was done, I actually had an artifact. So this is an Evernote note, and I had an artifact of me listening to the podcast and all the highlights of the interesting things. So this was an artifact that I could return to later for my own personal notes. I was pretty excited that this worked out well. I didn't know how it would go listening to a podcast at 3 times the speed while reading, but it was actually kind of fun, and it went by really quickly. And when I reflected on how well this worked for me, I decided, okay, this is a great way for me to use a podcast if I actually have 15 minutes where I can sit down and pay attention to the podcast, which for me, it's actually hard for me to carve 15 minutes out of my schedule to do that. And I realized, okay, well, going forward, if I'm going to do this again, I'll have to make sure I have dedicated time. And if I don't, I'm just going to have to multitask like I normally do. So this is just one simple way of how you can pay attention to how you learn. So I just told you a story about how I was learning. I didn't tell you a single thing about what I learned, right? But focusing on how you learn will help you learn a bit more about what's effective for you at what times based on what you're trying to do. So focus on how you learn so you can try a similar or different approach next time. And it's a journey, right? It's like you're always iterating and you're always growing. I don't think there's anybody out there who's a lifelong learner who figures it out and stops, right? It's an ongoing journey, and the more you pay attention to how you learn, the easier that journey will become. So these are the 5 tips I shared today for becoming a better learner. Identify your learning obstacles, use a learning resource in a different way, fit learning into your routine, reflect on what you learn, and reflect on how you learn. As you get better at learning, you can plan your learning, also known as going on a learning adventure, whenever you need to learn something new. And I'll give you an example of what I mean. Let's say a year ago you learned SAS, and now you need to learn SVG. So let's say that last year you converted your site's static CSS to SAS, and you had to learn that from scratch because you didn't know SAS. And now you want to learn SVG. So let's imagine that you reflected on your experience with learning SAS last year, and you kept a record of it, and you go back and you're like, okay, now I remember, when I learned SAS, this is how I did it. I picked up Dan Cederholm's book by A Book Apart, and I read a few chapters in that, and then I did some Googling because there were some unanswered questions I had from the book. And then I pinged a colleague I used to work with because she's really good at SAS, and I talked with her through a couple things that I was unsure of. And then I did some trial and error for about a day, and I figured it out. So if you have that in your history, that's a plan that you can now use as a starting point for your learning journey through SVG. And you might say, okay, this really worked well for me for SAS, so I'm going to try this when I need it for SVG. And now let's say that this year, you and your team have decided that you're going to convert some of the content, some of the images on your site to SVG to reduce page load and all that. So maybe, let's just say that that's a decision that you've come to. And now that you're doing that, you can use the plan that you used last year and then go on another journey, pay attention to how that's working for you, make some adjustments, reflect on it, keep a record of it, and then the next time you need to learn something, you now have a history of your learning, and you can adjust and plan as you go along. And the more you do this, the better you get at planning your future learning and the faster that you get at learning. We call this Choose Your Own Learning Adventure. I actually wrote a blog post about it on Center's site last year. And I'm really excited that this is how our students are going to learn how to learn. They're not just going to learn UX design, they're going to become more effective lifelong learners. So when they graduate and they go into the field, they'll be prepared to learn and they'll know how they learn best. Or they'll at least have a foundation for how they learn best that they can continue to grow throughout their lives and their careers. So we geek out about learning at Center because we know the most effective designers are great at learning. And again, by the time our students graduate, they'll become way better at learning than when they started at Center. I don't know anybody that tells me, I've learned everything I possibly need to know about UX design. I no longer need to improve my UX design skills. I've never heard a single person say that, and I don't think I'll ever hear anybody else say that, regardless of what they do in this field, whether it's front-end development, back-end development, DevOps. The learning never stops, and there's always growth and innovation going on that we need to keep up with. So if you leave today with anything, I hope it's this. Try my tips or experiment with your own to learn what works best for you. Again, what works for me isn't necessarily going to work for you. Your lifestyle and your schedule may be very different from mine. The way your brain is wired may be very different from mine. I'm very detail-oriented, I know that. So doing things like I just explained, like going through an Evernote note and making highlights, I love that. That's not gonna work for everybody, right? I can't imagine some of the people I work with doing that because it's just not how they learn, right? It's just not how they're wired. So figure out what works best for you, and please feel free to use any of my examples or my ideas from today. So to continue growing professionally and personally, we need to make time to sharpen the saw. We need to make time to learn, and we need to make sure we learn so that we can continue to be effective. But what if we focus not only on sharpening the saw, but on sharpening it more effectively and more efficiently? So let's say it normally takes a half an hour to sharpen a saw. What if we can get it down to 5 minutes? Imagine how many trees we can cut down. So if we can make our learning even more effective, imagine how much more that we can learn and how much more productive we can be as professionals. So again, I'm a faculty member at Center. We are opening on October 17th, so if you or someone you know might make a great student, please feel free to contact me or check us out online at centercenter.com. Thank you. Thank you for putting up with my corny metaphors of sharpening the saw. I just love that story. So.
Definitely have time for a couple of questions.
So if you're someone who maybe hasn't given focus in the past to how you learn, is there a place that you might recommend that you start examining what is and isn't working for you, how you might start to sharpen that saw?
What to start with? I would probably say like reflecting. So reflecting on what you're learning and how you learn. Maybe you can start with one, like reflecting on what you learn. So talking about it more or writing it down more, whatever works for you, whether you read a lot of books and you want to write reviews on Amazon, or if there's like a colleague that you have that you really get along with who loves to talk about what they learn, like maybe taking 5 minutes every day to do that. I would start there, yeah. Or you can go back and kind of peruse my slides and just, there's a lot in here, so feel free to pick with a starting point that works for you. But that's a good question, because if you, like I've come so far in 2 years just from working at Center, and it's taken me 2 years just to get so much better at learning. I wouldn't have tried to start out with everything at once. So I'm glad you asked that question. I would just pick something you're comfortable with and start there. I've answered all of your questions.
All of it. Thorough presentation. Thank you, Jessica. Round of applause.
Thank you, Brett.
All right, guys. You'll stick around for a little bit, right? Yeah. So if anybody has any questions you don't want to ask publicly, then you can ask privately. Scenic City Summit tomorrow. We'll see you guys there. Hopefully, come out. Even if you didn't buy a ticket, and like stand at the door and I don't know, like look sad or something, and maybe somebody will give you a ticket if you don't have the money. I don't. Anyway, we'll see you guys next week.
Thank you.